All I did was say yes to a simple favor, one I thought would take no more than an hour. But what followed shattered my sense of right and wrong forever. It wasn't a big ask, just something small, something kind, the sort of thing anyone would do for a friend. I didn't even hesitate when he asked. But what I didn't know was that moment, saying yes, would become the crack that split my whole world apart. It's been 9 months since that day, and I still can't look my husband in the eyes without flinching. You ever feel like your heart is holding onto a scream you can't let out? Like there's this weight pressing down on your chest, but you smile through it because what else can you do? I carry that weight every day now. Smile at the dinner table. Kiss my kids goodnight. Pretend everything is fine. But it's not. And deep down, I know it never will be again. I didn't mean to fall into anything. I wasn't looking for it. Wasn't unhappy enough to go searching. But sometimes, it's not about what you're searching for. It's about what you're missing. And you don't even realize it until someone else gives it to you. And that's what makes it worse. Because I wasn't some woman plotting to betray anyone. I was just tired, lonely, invisible. You know that feeling when you're in the same room with someone you love, but it's like you're miles apart? When the silence between you says more than words ever could. That's what my marriage had become. A quiet, slow drift. And then, Jason walked in. My husband's best friend. The man I'd known for years. A man who always had a smile ready, who remembered the little things, who looked at me like I still existed. Like I still mattered. It started with a joke. Then a compliment. Then a favor. A simple favor. And now I don't even recognize the woman I see in the mirror. There are some stories that don't have a clean ending. Just messy hearts. Broken boundaries. And choices you wish you could erase. This is one of those stories. My name is Mia. I've been married to Daniel for 12 years. 12 long years. On the outside, we looked like one of those perfectly assembled couples you see in Christmas cards. Nice house, clean smiles, 2 beautiful kids, even a golden retriever for a while. People would say things like, "You two are so lucky," and I'd smile and nod, because what else could I do? It's easier to lie when the lie looks good from the outside. But inside, I felt like wallpaper. Faded. Flat. Just there, always in the background, holding up the picture, but never really seen. Daniel. He's not a bad man. He's responsible, driven, focused. He works in finance, early mornings, late nights, endless conference calls with people who only seem to care about numbers and margins. And I used to admire that in him. I used to love how sharp he was, how in control he always seemed. But somewhere along the line, that control, it turned into distance. He was a good provider. I'll give him that. The bills were always paid, the fridge was always full, and the kids always had what they needed. But as a husband, emotionally, physically, he'd checked out. And maybe I had too, in my own way. He hadn't touched me like he meant it in over a year. Not passionately. Not with any real presence. The kind of touch that makes you feel like you're the only person in the room, that had disappeared long ago. Now it was just the occasional brush of a shoulder in the kitchen, a dry kiss on the cheek before bed. We'd become roommates. Coordinators of schedules. Parents. But not lovers. Not even friends, really. And the thing is, I didn't even realize how deeply that emptiness had settled into me until I started avoiding mirrors. Until the sound of his key in the front door made me feel more dread than joy. I have 2 kids. A boy and a girl. They're my world. But even motherhood, as beautiful as it is, can swallow you whole. I was constantly giving. Breakfast, school runs, homework, bath time, bedtime. Rinse and repeat. No one tells you how much of yourself you'll lose. How easily your name becomes mom and nothing else. Most days, I felt like a ghost. Everyone needed me, but no one really saw me. And then, there was Jason. Jason had been Daniel's best friend since college. He was the opposite of Daniel in so many ways. Where Daniel was quiet and serious, Jason was open and light. He had this way of making people feel at ease, like you could breathe a little easier when he was around. He laughed easily, teased without being mean. And he looked at people when they spoke, really looked. He'd been around our family for years. Birthday parties, barbecues, random Saturday football games on TV. Always the fun uncle, the extra hand, the one who brought over dessert even when no one asked. And I'd never really seen him in that way before. Until one day. I did. It was after his divorce. His wife had left him for someone else, and he moved back to town, trying to get his life in order again. He'd stop by more often, sometimes to talk to Daniel, sometimes just because he was bored and didn't want to be alone in his empty apartment. And slowly, he and I started talking more. About nothing at first. Then about life. Then about the things we missed. The things we needed. The things we thought we had but didn't. I remember one night, Daniel was upstairs working late in his office, and I was cleaning up after dinner. Jason stayed behind to help with the dishes. We talked about music. About how the world had changed. About how lonely it felt sometimes to be an adult. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, he looked at me, really looked, and said, "You know, you've still got that spark. Don't let anyone make you forget that." It was such a small thing to say. But I swear, it was like someone opened a window inside me I didn't even know had been closed. From then on, something shifted. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way Jason lingered after dropping something off. The way he listened when I talked about the kids, or my day, or even nothing important at all. The way he smiled, like he knew something I didn't. Like he saw something in me I thought had disappeared. I didn't flirt. Not at first. I didn't cross any lines. But I can't lie and say I wasn't drawn to the attention. The warmth. The validation. Our home. It was beautiful on the outside. Granite countertops. White walls that stayed clean. A perfectly trimmed lawn. A quiet neighborhood with friendly neighbors who waved when you passed by. But inside it felt like a museum. Cold. Silent. Preserved but lifeless. Everything was in its place. Except me. I'd walk down the hallway at night, past the kids' rooms, past Daniel's office with the door cracked open and the blue light of his computer screen glowing, and I'd feel this ache deep in my chest. A longing I couldn't explain. Jason didn't feel that ache. But he noticed it, and that in itself was enough to wake something up in me. One afternoon, just as I was folding laundry in the living room, Jason stopped by. It wasn't unusual. He came around often enough that the kids barely looked up anymore. He was holding 2 paint samples in his hand and laughing to himself. "I'm making a mess of this decorating thing," he said, walking in like he always did, comfortable, familiar, like he belonged. I laughed. "You're asking the wrong person. My idea of design is not tripping over Legos on the way to the kitchen." "No, seriously," he said. "I could use your help. I need a woman's eye. It'll take 30 minutes, tops. I've got to pick out some furniture and art stuff, and I don't want the place to look like a bachelor pad exploded." Before I could answer, Daniel called from upstairs. "You should go, Mia. He needs help, and I don't have time for that stuff." And just like that, it was decided. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, grabbed my purse, and told the kids I'd be back soon. I didn't think anything of it. I really didn't. The home store was one of those cozy, upscale places, dim lighting, soft music, everything arranged just so. Not your typical furniture warehouse, but somewhere you'd go if you cared about aesthetics. The kind of place where you could get lost just running your hands over soft throws and driftwood wall art. Jason was like a kid in a candy store, cracking jokes, pulling out the most ridiculous things just to make me laugh. He held up a zebra-striped rug at one point and asked, "Too much jungle? Or just enough Tarzan?" We laughed a lot that day. Too much, probably. And I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in a long time. I didn't feel like a mom. I didn't feel like someone's forgotten wife. I felt light. Like myself again. But it wasn't just the laughter. It was the way he listened. He'd say things like, "You always pick earth tones, huh? You like warm spaces." And I remember freezing for a second because, how did he notice that? Daniel never did. I'd redecorated the living room last spring and Daniel hadn't even looked up from his laptop. Jason noticed everything. My favorite colors. That I wore my hair differently when I was in a good mood. That I rubbed my thumb against my palm when I was anxious. It was flattering. No, it was more than that. It was addictive. At one point, I was trying to reach a picture frame on a high shelf. It was just out of reach. Jason stepped in behind me and stretched up to grab it, and for a moment, just a second, his body was close to mine. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of him. Close enough that I forgot how to breathe. When he handed me the frame, our hands brushed. Neither of us moved. His eyes met mine, and there was this silence that hung between us. Not awkward, not forced, just charged. The air felt thicker. My heart was pounding, and I don't even think I blinked. Then I laughed. Too quickly. Too loudly. And just like that, the moment passed. It was innocent. At least, that's what I told myself. That's what I needed to believe. I told myself I was imagining things. That I was overthinking it. That it was just a nice afternoon with a friend who made me feel seen. But later that night, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, my hands moved automatically, but my mind was somewhere else. I kept thinking about the way his voice softened when he said my name. The way he looked at me, not with hunger, but with intention. Like I mattered. I didn't tell Daniel about the store. I didn't mention the zebra rug or the picture frame. I didn't say a word. Because deep down, something had shifted. I just wasn't ready to admit it. And that wasn't the last time Jason asked for help. Or the last time I said yes. After that first trip to the store, it became easier to say yes. Jason would call or text every now and then, nothing out of line. Just little things. What do you think of this lamp? Or should I hang the art lower or higher? And each time, I found myself responding faster than I meant to. We started meeting for coffee. At first, we called it design check-ins. An excuse, really. A reason to sit and talk without naming what it was. We'd sit in that little cafe on Pine Street, the one with the mismatched mugs and the cinnamon smell that lingered in the air. It became our spot. Familiar. Safe. We'd laugh a lot. He'd tease me about how I overanalyzed everything, and I'd roll my eyes when he forgot half the measurements I gave him for his apartment. It all felt so light. So easy. I hadn't felt that kind of lightness in years. And yet, underneath it all, I felt something twisting in my chest. A knot tightening every time I got dressed to see him. Every time I stayed out longer than I said I would. Every time I cleared my messages before walking in the front door. I wasn't cheating. I told myself that over and over. I wasn't cheating. I was just seen. Do you know what it feels like to be seen? To have someone actually look at you. Not through you. Not past you. But right at you. Like you matter. Like your thoughts are interesting. Like your presence is enough? Jason made me feel like I was still a woman. Not just a mom. Not just someone's wife. But someone worthy of attention. Of laughter. Of feeling. And Daniel? Daniel never asked where I'd been. He never questioned the extra time. Never looked up when I came in the door an hour late from groceries or errands. Maybe he trusted me too much. Or maybe he just didn't notice anymore. I used to wonder if he'd always been like that, quiet, distracted, half absent, or if it had happened slowly, bit by bit, while we were both too busy to see it. The kids, the routines, the life we built, it had all blurred together. And some nights, I'd lie beside him in bed, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing, and I'd think to myself, would he even notice if I disappeared? Would he roll over and keep sleeping? That thought haunted me, because I didn't want to disappear. I just wanted someone, him, to pull me close again, to care, to ask, to see. But he didn't. And Jason kept showing up. He helped me move a bookshelf one afternoon, and we ended up sitting on the floor surrounded by books and dust and laughter. He made a joke about one of the romance novels I'd left lying around, and I hit him with a pillow. We laughed until we couldn't breathe. Then we were quiet. He looked at me. Not like a friend. Not like Daniel ever had. And something shifted in the air. I stood up quickly. Pretended I needed to make tea. Anything to stop the moment from settling in too deep. But it followed me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about his eyes. About how long he'd looked at me. About the ache in my chest that I couldn't name anymore. The guilt started to grow like vines, slow but strong. Wrapping around everything. around my smiles, around my silence, around the way I started pulling away from Daniel, inch by inch, just to protect the pieces of myself I felt I was losing again. But I kept going back, because I couldn't stay away. We texted every night now. Nothing inappropriate. Not at first. Just little things. Inside jokes. Memes. Quotes from movies we both loved. And every night, I'd hear the soft buzz of my phone and feel a thrill that didn't belong there. Daniel never noticed. Or if he did, he said nothing. And somehow, that silence hurt more than any suspicion ever could. One evening, Jason and I were driving back from a home goods store. The sun was setting, casting this soft golden light over everything. He was humming along to the radio, tapping the steering wheel, when he suddenly turned to me. "I don't think I've ever met someone who understands me the way you do." I froze. He wasn't smiling when he said it. There was no humor in his voice. Just this quiet vulnerability that landed in the pit of my stomach like a stone. "I mean it," he said. "I talk to you and it's like, I don't have to explain everything. You just get it." I didn't know what to say. I should have said nothing. I should have changed the subject. Redirected. But instead, I felt my throat tighten. My eyes sting. Because I did understand him. And worse, he understood me too. He saw the cracks. He saw what Daniel didn't. And that scared me more than anything else. Because it wasn't about furniture anymore. Or design. Or even attention. It was about connection. And I was dangerously close to crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But then Jason said something that made my heart stop. We sat there in the car as the sky darkened, the soft hum of the engine the only sound for a moment. Jason's words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. If I'd met you before Daniel, things would have been different. I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to pretend I didn't hear it. I wanted to laugh it off, like a silly compliment that meant nothing. But it wasn't silly. And it meant something. We both knew it. He glanced over at me. Our eyes met. And for the first time, I didn't look away. That night, I laid in bed beside Daniel, wide awake. My body was still, but my mind, it was screaming. I kept replaying that moment over and over again. The tone of Jason's voice. The sincerity in his eyes. The what if hanging between us like fog. The next day, I dressed differently. Subtle, but intentional. A little more effort. A softer blouse. A touch of perfume I hadn't worn in months. Not for Daniel. Not for the kids. Just, in case Jason dropped by. And he did. He stopped in around noon. Said he was just passing through. Asked if I wanted to grab lunch. I said yes without checking the calendar. I was supposed to meet Daniel at his office that day. Some charity luncheon. Something we RSVP'd 2 weeks ago. I told him I wasn't feeling well. It wasn't a total lie. My heart was tangled in knots. Lunch with Jason was casual. Sandwiches, iced tea, small talk. But there was something under it all now. A current. A tension. He reached across the table to hand me a napkin, and his fingers brushed mine. He didn't pull away. I should have. But I didn't. Because in that moment, the warmth of his hand against mine was the first thing in months that made me feel alive. And that scared me. But it didn't stop me. I started checking my phone constantly. Watching for his name. Waiting for the 3 little dots to appear. That little spark of adrenaline every time his message popped up. Thinking about you. Can't wait to see you. Miss our talks. It became a secret I wrapped myself in. A hidden part of my life that no one else could touch. I told myself it was harmless. Just attention. Just comfort. Just 2 lonely people leaning on each other. But it was more than that. It was always more than that. I began to find excuses to see him. Errands. Design advice. Helping him pick out curtains, then towels, then dishes. And every time, we'd talk longer, laugh harder, sit just a little bit closer. One night after dinner, he stayed behind. The kids were in bed. Daniel was holed up in his office as usual, typing away on some urgent email. Jason and I sat in the living room. We shared a glass of wine. Talked about music. I told him about the songs I used to dance to when I was younger. He smiled and said, "I can picture that. You, spinning around a kitchen, eyes closed, hair everywhere." Then it got quiet. He reached for the wine glass in my hand, his fingers brushed mine, then stayed there. Just a second too long. I should have pulled away. But I didn't. And he didn't either. We just sat there, fingers touching, hearts racing, both pretending not to notice what was happening between us. The next day, I deleted our text thread. I was terrified Daniel would find it. But deleting the messages didn't delete the feeling. If anything, it made it worse. Like trying to bury something that had already taken root. And the more I buried, the deeper I dug myself. I started lying. Not big lies. Just enough to move the lines around. I'd say I was at the grocery store when I wasn't. I said I had a headache when I just didn't want to be touched. I stopped inviting Daniel to go on walks with me. Started going alone, except I wasn't alone. Not really. Jason would meet me at the trail behind the old park. We'd walk. Talk. Sometimes we wouldn't say much at all. But everything we didn't say hung in the space between us. The almost betrayal came on a Thursday. I'll never forget it. Jason had invited me to see how the apartment looked now that it was mostly done. He was proud. He'd actually taken most of my advice. The place looked good. Warm. Lived in. Like someone cared. We ordered takeout. Ate on his couch. Laughed about a terrible lamp he insisted on keeping. As I was leaving, he walked me to the door. I turned to say goodbye, and he leaned in slow, gentle. His lips brushed my cheek. But it wasn't just a friendly kiss. It was too close to the corner of my mouth. Too deliberate. He lingered. And then, he paused. Like he was waiting. Waiting for me to turn my head. I didn't. But I also didn't move away. We stood there for what felt like forever. Then I opened the door and left without saying a word. That night, I couldn't stop shaking. Not because I was afraid of being caught, but because I was afraid of how much I wanted to go back. The lines were blurring. My marriage felt like a duty. My days felt like tasks. And Jason, he felt like a lifeline. Like a reminder that I was still someone worth noticing. I thought I could control it. I thought I was strong enough. Until that night at his place. It was a Friday night. The sky had been overcast all day, and by early evening, the rain came in sheets, soft at first, then steady, relentless. The kind of rain that makes the world feel smaller, quieter, like everything slows down. Daniel had a late dinner with clients. He didn't even ask what I was doing that night. Just gave me a quick nod, his phone already to his ear, talking numbers as he grabbed his coat and walked out the door. I stood there for a few minutes, watching the rain slide down the windows. My phone buzzed. "Jason, you free tonight? I picked up that bottle of wine you said you loved. Come warm up with me." I stared at the message for a long time. My thumb hovered over the screen. I could have said no. I should have said no. But I didn't. I told the kids I'd be back before they went to bed. Left a note in case Daniel came home early. Then I grabbed my umbrella and drove. The streets were quiet, glistening in the rain. His apartment windows glowed warm against the gray outside. It felt inviting, dangerous. I could already feel my heart pounding before I stepped out of the car. When he opened the door, I was hit by the scent of something rich, cinnamon, maybe cloves. A candle flickered on the counter. 2 glasses. 1 bottle, already opened. He smiled. Softly. "Come in," he said. "You're soaked." I stood in his doorway for a second, almost willing myself to turn around. But my feet didn't listen. Inside, everything felt too quiet. Too intimate. The lights were low. The only sound was the rain tapping against the windows and the occasional crackle from the wick of the candle. We sat on the couch. Close, but not touching. The wine was smooth, heavy. We talked about nothing, and then suddenly about everything. About Daniel. About his distance. My loneliness. Jason didn't push. He didn't rush. He just listened. And then he said something I wasn't ready for. "If you were mine, I would have noticed when you started fading." The words pierced something inside me. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just sat there, eyes fixed on the flame dancing between us. And then he asked, barely above a whisper, "Do you ever wonder what it would be like if things were different?" I nodded. We were both quiet. And in that silence, charged, thick, impossible, he leaned in. Slowly, gently. And I didn't move. I didn't stop him. I didn't even flinch. His lips brushed mine, not with hunger, but with this aching softness, like he'd been holding it back for far too long. And still, I didn't stop him. It felt wrong. So wrong. And inevitable. That night blurred in my memory like a half-remembered dream. Soft hands, whispered apologies, wine-stained breath, clothes falling to the floor in slow motion. 1,000 unspoken fears melted into skin and heat and longing. I wish I could say I stopped him. I wish I could say I regretted it right away. But I didn't. Because in that moment, I felt everything I'd been starving for. The touch, the closeness, the sense of being wanted. It was intoxicating. But morning has a way of making everything look different. I woke up before he did. The candle had burned low. The rain had stopped. And suddenly, the silence felt hollow. Ugly. I got dressed slowly. My hands were shaking. I didn't leave a note. I didn't even look back as I closed his door behind me. When I got home, the house was dark. Daniel wasn't back yet. The kids were asleep. Everything was still, just as I had left it. Except nothing was the same anymore. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the glass I'd left on the counter earlier, and I felt it. This crushing wave of shame, of guilt, of panic. I had done it. I had crossed the line. There was no taking it back. No undoing it. And suddenly, the world felt too loud, too sharp. My skin felt like it didn't fit right anymore. My heartbeat was like thunder in my ears. I wanted to scream, or cry, or disappear. But I did none of those things. I just stood there, still, silent. Because once you break something like that, once you betray something sacred, it doesn't just go away. It doesn't just vanish in the morning light. I told myself I could live with it, that I could bury it, pretend it was just one moment, just one mistake. But the universe doesn't let betrayal go unpaid for long. And mine was coming, faster than I ever could have imagined. The next morning, I moved like a shadow through the house. I didn't speak much, didn't eat. I made the kids breakfast on autopilot, smiling when they asked for syrup, nodding when they told me stories from their dreams. But inside, I felt like I was standing on broken glass. I avoided mirrors. I couldn't face myself. I didn't want to see the version of me staring back, the version I didn't recognize anymore. The version that crossed the line. The version that let it happen. I opened the drawer in the kitchen and picked up my phone. My hands were trembling as I stared at the screen. There were already 3 unread messages from Jason. "Are you okay? We need to talk. Please don't shut me out." I stared at them for a long time. Then I deleted them. Every single one. And I turned the phone off. It wasn't just guilt, it was something deeper. Shame? Fear? I wasn't even sure. All I knew was that if I let him in again, even just to talk, I might fall even further. And I didn't know how much further there was left to go before I completely lost myself. I didn't reply. I couldn't. That day, I avoided everything. I didn't go out. I didn't answer calls. I didn't leave the house except to take out the trash, and even then, I looked around like someone was watching me, like I was a fugitive in my own life. When Daniel came home, something was different. He looked at me longer than usual, really looked. Like he was trying to find something on my face. Some sign. Some crack in the surface. "Everything all right?" he asked, casually, like he already knew it wasn't. I nodded too quickly. "Yeah. Just tired." He didn't push. But he didn't smile either. Instead, he walked past me, dropped his briefcase on the floor harder than he needed to, and went straight upstairs. And that hit harder than if he'd yelled. That night, the distance between us felt like a canyon. He didn't kiss me goodnight. Didn't even touch my hand. He lay there with his back to me. His breathing steady. His silence louder than any fight we'd ever had. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the walls close in. I kept waiting for Jason to stop trying. But he didn't. The next day, more texts came. Long ones. Short ones. All begging for a response. You don't have to go through this alone. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have let it happen like that. But I meant every second of it. Talk to me. I turned my phone off again. I thought it would make things better. But it didn't. Because everything at home started to shift. Daniel grew colder. Distant in a different way now, calculated. There were longer stares. Shorter conversations. His I love yous disappeared. He left earlier in the mornings. Came back later at night. And he watched me. I could feel it. Not obvious. But enough. Enough to make my skin prickle. Enough to make my chest tighten when I heard his footsteps behind me. Enough to make me start wondering if he knew. Or maybe he didn't know exactly what happened. But he knew something. He had to. You can only pretend for so long before the cracks show. I became hyper-aware of everything. The way I spoke. How long I looked at my phone. Where I left my keys. Whether my clothes smelled like candle wax or red wine. The guilt was eating me alive. And the silence from Jason became louder than ever. Because even though I wasn't answering, his words still echoed in my head. That night, his hands, his eyes, the things we said. Things I couldn't take back. I began snapping at the kids. Not yelling, but shorter, sharper. My patience was thinner. I hated that they could feel something was wrong, even if they didn't understand what it was. One night, after I put them to bed, I sat in the hallway alone. Lights off. Back against the wall. I felt like the walls were closing in around me. What had I done? Who was I? I used to think I was a good person. A loyal wife. A devoted mother. But now, I didn't know anymore. Everything I was had unraveled in one night. And then, as I was changing the sheets a few days later, I lifted the mattress to tuck the corner tight, something I've done 1,000 times before. But this time, I noticed something. A folded piece of paper, tucked near the edge. Just barely out of sight. I hesitated. My stomach dropped. I reached for it slowly, as if touching it too quickly might set something on fire. And when I opened it, I froze. It was Daniel's handwriting. My hands were trembling as I held the letter. Daniel's handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, clean, careful. The kind of writing that always looked like he was trying too hard to stay in control. I unfolded it slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The first line stopped me cold. I don't know how to say this to you out loud, so maybe writing it will be easier. I sat on the edge of the bed and kept reading. I've been watching you for weeks now. Not in a creepy way. Just noticing. For the first time in a long time, I've really noticed you. And I realize now that I haven't been doing that for a while. That I let us drift. That I let you feel alone while I buried myself in work and thought that paying bills and keeping the lights on was enough. I blinked hard. My throat tightened. You don't laugh the same way anymore. You don't touch me the same way. And I kept telling myself it was just life, just stress. But the truth is, I failed you. I stopped showing up. And I hate that it took me this long to see it. There was a pause in the handwriting. A break in the flow, like he had hesitated. But I want to try again, Mia. I want us back. If there's still time. I didn't realize I was crying until the ink started to blur in front of me. The letter, it wasn't new. It had been dated 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks before that night. 3 weeks before I crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He had been trying. Quietly. Alone. While I was somewhere else, wrapped in another man's arms. Chasing something I didn't even understand. And suddenly, it hit me all at once. I broke everything, just before he was about to fix it. I folded the letter and placed it in my lap, staring at the floor like it held the answers I couldn't find in my own heart. The guilt turned into a sharp ache in my stomach. It was too much. Too heavy. Like my own body was rejecting what I'd done. Because how do you make peace with betraying someone just as they were reaching out to save you? I thought about Jason. His voice. His hands. His presence. And then I thought about Daniel's letter. The way he still called me his. The way he wanted us to find our way back. And for the first time, I wasn't sure who I was crying for. Daniel? Myself? or the version of me that made the choice I couldn't take back? I began to question everything. Was I ever really in love with Jason? Or was I just in love with the way he looked at me? With the feeling of being wanted? Because there's a difference between attention and affection. Jason noticed me. That much is true. But did he really love me? Or did we just both stumble into each other's loneliness at the wrong time? Was I trying to escape Daniel? Or was I trying to escape the feeling of being invisible? It's strange how one moment can undo years of memories. How one night can steal the meaning from a lifetime. And now here I was, sitting on our bed, holding a letter from a man who was trying to come back to me while I had already emotionally stepped out the door. I thought about confessing, just telling him everything, letting it all pour out like poison from a wound, hoping that honesty might be enough. But then what? Would it heal us? Or finish breaking us for good? Would he forgive me? Or would he never look at me the same again? And maybe worst of all, would I ever forgive myself? Because that's the part no one tells you about betrayal, the way it follows you long after the act is over. Long after the sheets are cold and the wine glass is washed. It whispers to you in quiet moments. It rewrites your memories. It stains everything. And there, in that silence, with that letter resting like a brick in my lap, I realized something. I had been searching for love, but I'd forgotten what love really looked like. Not the butterflies. Not the stolen glances. Not the late-night texts. But someone seeing your flaws and still choosing you. Someone saying, I know I failed you, but I want to try again. And I threw that away. For what? For warmth in a moment? For a taste of something that couldn't last? I pressed the letter to my chest and cried. For Daniel. For myself. For everything that could have been different, if only I had waited a little longer. Have you ever made a choice that you couldn't take back? Not something big. Not something bold. Just a small moment. A yes, a glance, a step forward that ended up changing everything. I did. And I still live with that moment every single day. There are nights I lie awake, wondering how different life would be if I had just said no. If I had just stayed home. If I had waited one more week. If I had believed that Daniel could change, that we could change. Would it have made a difference? Would I have still fallen? Would I still have broken something so fragile, so sacred? I don't have those answers. But maybe you do. Would you tell the truth? Would you risk it all to cleanse your soul? Or would you carry the secret with you, pretending things are fine while something inside you slowly crumbles? I don't know what's right anymore. All I know is that I made a choice that can't be undone. And now I live in the quiet spaces between what I feel and what I pretend to feel. So I'm asking you, honestly, from one human heart to another, what would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you confess? Would you walk away? Or would you keep the silence and pray it never catches up with you? Comment below, please. I want to know. I need to know I'm not the only one who stood at this kind of crossroad. And if this story touched something in you, if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever made a mistake, or been close to one, like, share, and subscribe. Because there are so many stories out there, hiding in plain sight, and this is a place where they finally get to breathe. It's been a few months now. Daniel still doesn't know. Or maybe he does, and just hasn't found the words to say it out loud. We sleep in the same bed, share the same space, share meals, responsibilities, a life. But there's a silence between us now, a stillness. Not the comforting kind that couples fall into after years of loving each other. This is different. It's a silence that hides 1,000 unspoken things. A wall that neither of us knows how to climb. I see the letter sometimes, tucked deep in the drawer beneath my sweaters. I don't know why I keep it. Maybe as a reminder. Maybe as punishment. Maybe because it's the closest thing I have to the version of Daniel who still wanted to fight for us. Jason and I don't talk anymore. I deleted his number. Blocked him. Erased every message. But I still think of him sometimes. Not because I miss him, but because he showed me something about myself I didn't want to see. Something I needed to fix, but didn't fix in time. And that's the cruel part about betrayal. It doesn't always come from hate. It doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from hunger. Hunger for touch. Hunger for attention. Hunger for something you forgot you needed until it was too late. I got what I wanted. For one night. One night of feeling seen. One night of feeling desired. One night where I let myself believe I deserved more. And in that one night, I lost what I truly needed for a lifetime. Now, every day is a performance. And every quiet moment between Daniel and me is a reminder that nothing is simple anymore. That a simple favor turned into a secret I carry in silence. And that silence? It has its own weight. A simple favor. And now nothing is simple anymore.